Today, we're going to talk about something that is so often wrapped up in judgment and just plain misinformation, and that's addiction. But our goal here is to cut through all of that noise and really unpack the modern clinical understanding of what's happening inside the brain.
Maybe this sounds familiar. This is the conflict that so many people feel inside. They look at the old stereotype of an addict and they think, that's not me at all. And yet, at the same time, they can see a pattern in their own life that they know is causing harm, a pattern they just feel powerless to change. It's that very tension that modern science is trying to help us understand.
And this right here, this is probably the single most important shift in how we see this. For generations, addiction was treated like a failure of character, a moral weakness. But the science today is crystal clear. We're not talking about a lack of willpower. We are talking about a treatable, chronic medical disease that's rooted in our biology and our brain chemistry. So we're starting with this not me conflict because it's just so common. And as we dive into the science, I just want to be clear that this is for educational purposes. It's about giving you context, not a diagnosis. If anything we talk about resonates with you or makes you think of someone you care about, the best next step is always to reach out to a qualified professional for guidance. To really move away from that stigma, the language had to change. Back in 2014, the American Psychiatric Association got rid of those old judgmental terms like abuse and brought everything under a single diagnosis, substance use disorder, or SUD for short. The key word there isn't addiction with all its baggage, but disorder. It's a medical term, plain and simple. And this isn't some fringe idea, Leading organizations like the American Society of Addiction Medicine have all established this as a medical framework. Understanding the brain science isn't about making excuses. It's about providing context. And that context, well, that's the first step toward finding real, lasting change. Okay, so what's really crucial to get is that this isn't like an on or off switch. You're not just fine one day and then suddenly have a severe disorder the next. The whole idea behind SUD is that it's a progressive thing. It exists on a continuum of severity. So how is that severity actually measured? Well, it's based on how many symptoms a person meets out of a list of 11 diagnostic criteria, all within a 12-month period. If you meet 2 or 3 of those criteria, it's considered a mild SUD. 4 to 5 is moderate, and if you meet 6 or more, that's considered a severe SUD. This spectrum just helps us see that the struggle is real no matter where you fall on it. Now, to make all this a little more tangible, we can actually group those 11 criteria into 4 simple themes. You can think of them as signals from the brain that show how our biology is starting to drive our behavior. Let's break down how this builds, starting with the first and most important signal of all. This one is the absolute core of the disorder. It's the moment when a person's relationship with a substance starts to shift from something that's voluntary, maybe recreational, to something that feels compulsive and uncontrollable. The behaviors here are really specific. It's things like using more of something or for longer than you originally planned to. It's wanting to stop, trying to stop, but just not being able to. It's when a huge amount of your time and energy starts to revolve around getting, using, and recovering from the substance. And finally, there's that intense, overwhelming desire to use, what we call a craving. Okay, so let's look at the neuroscience of that craving, because this is a total game changer in our understanding. We used to think addiction was all about chasing pleasure, the liking. But the science shows something different happens. The brain actually gets rewired. The deep survival parts of our brain get hijacked, and they start to prioritize the compulsive wanting of the substance, even if the liking, that actual high or good feeling, is long gone. This is the second signal, and it's where that internal struggle starts to become visible to the outside world. This is the point where the life that was built around the person slowly starts to fall apart. The criteria here are all about measurable loss. It's when using starts to cause problems at work, school, or at home. It's when important hobbies, friendships, or activities that you used to love are given up in favor of using. And really critically, it's when you keep using even when it's clearly causing or worsening problems with your family and your friends. The third signal is when the behavior continues even when you're faced with clear and immediate danger. The loss of control becomes so profound that it actually starts to override the basic human instinct for self-preservation. Driving while intoxicated is the classic example, right? Brain imaging studies literally show that substances can reduce activity in the very parts of our brain that are responsible for judgment and impulse control. So the person knows the risk, but the brain's ability to actually act on that knowledge
is impaired. All right, our fourth and final signal is what most people think of first when they hear the word addiction, and that is the physical stuff, tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance just means you need more and more to get the same effect, and withdrawal is that awful physical and emotional state that happens when you stop. But here is a really, really important distinction. Physical dependence is not the same thing as addiction. For example, your body can adapt to certain pain medications or even some antidepressants. You can develop tolerance and withdrawal. That's a normal physiological process. Addiction, or substance use disorder, is defined by that loss of behavioral control, that compulsive seeking we talked about, even when you know the harm it's causing. So with that whole framework in mind, let's pivot for a second and just turn to a couple of practical questions. This isn't about diagnosing yourself. It's really just about creating a space for some honest, non-judgmental self-reflection. First, just take a quiet moment and ask yourself, with some gentle curiosity, what is this costing me? Think about the tangible things first. What are the financial or work-related costs that have maybe piled up? What about the costs to your relationships, with friends, with family? And finally, what has it cost your health, your energy, your emotional well-being? The second question is all about control. Again, just reflect honestly with yourself. What happens when you try to stop or even just cut back? Is there an intense, overwhelming desire, that craving, that makes you want to start again? Do you experience negative physical or emotional symptoms that feel so uncomfortable that the only way to make them go away is to use again? If the answers to those questions bring up some concern, the most important thing to know is that you are not alone, and this is not a personal failure. The relapse rates for substance use disorders are somewhere between 40 and 60%, and that's very similar to other chronic medical conditions like diabetes or hypertension or asthma. And this is exactly why this new understanding is so vital. Seeing this as a chronic brain disease removes the blame, and it removes the shame. It makes it really clear that specialized treatment, not just more willpower or punishment, is the necessary and the most compassionate response. So we'll leave you with this question to reflect on. What in your life, or even just in your perception of yourself, could begin to change if you replaced that self-judgment with some scientific understanding? What possibilities might open up when you look at yourself with a little more science and a lot less shame?